Yeah, and I welcome you all to the session on PIDs for facilities. So let me start sharing my screen. Okay, yeah, so again, welcome everybody for the session on persistent identifiers for facilities. And so this has, say, a history. We already had a similar session at the last plenary in November in San Jose. We were discussing the question what PIDs would be, say, useful to identify facilities. But there was no consensus in the last session. There were candidates in the discussion were RAWs and persistent instrument PIDs. And either option was deemed as not appropriate by some of the participants. And so my impression from the last session was that there were different concepts of what is a facility in people's minds, and that was more or less a problem why we didn't come to a conclusion. And that is why we now thought it would be useful to continue that discussion at this plenary. And we will now have a few, say, contributed talks ahead with some input on what we mean by facilities. The first one will be by Marek Zezelbauer, sorry, on facilities from data management tools perspective. We will have a contribution by Matt Meyernick on a project on fair facility and instruments that is, I believe, running since like 2 years or something, but Matt will tell us. And I will say, describe the situation on the perspective of the large-scale photon and neutron facilities. And with that input, I hope we can then come to a little bit more, say, fruitful discussion. So I would like to stop sharing now and leave the floor to Marek. And you are very welcome to share your screen.
Hello, can you see my
Yeah,
slides?
looks good.
Perfect. So thanks, Rolf, for letting me to express our view. It's one of the opinions about facilities and how we distinguish facilities and instruments in our community of material sciences and engineering, so bioimaging in Czech Republic mainly. Oops, it's not moving. Yeah, sorry. So I'll first explain the current situation, how the facilities research infrastructures and facilities are working in Czech Republic, and what do we expect where it could move on. And I also probably will mention how it is similar to, for example, Austria or Poland, which are countries which are neighboring Czech Republic, and then what is our view on identifying instruments and facilities in the process of when we are developing automation systems for harvesting data and metadata. So how we handle this. So we in Czech Republic largely, especially in the infrastructures I will mention, we have instruments in facilities. So what is meant by facility is some space somewhere, usually with a few often more expensive instruments, which are not available in every lab. We have also smaller facilities, which have only 1 or 2 instruments, but usually they are very unique in some of its properties, or there is unique expertise in this facility, how to use the instrument. So this is how we think about facilities, for example, in Czech bioimaging infrastructure. And then we have a community or users of these facilities, but these users usually they approach the facility in a more administrative way first. So to register for the facility access, they will acquire the account. They are usually asked to create a link for if there is certain level of financial contribution. So the user gets registered with the facility, as indicated by the arrow. The user wants to use an instrument, and it is the specific instrument which is then used for a specific measurement. So it doesn't have to be only the instrument. It could be, as indicated below, it could be also some computational processing of data, which is following the measurement. Another user would simply approach the same or the other facility. I've forgotten to indicate in this animation that the brownish user can access one facility, but they can often, sometimes the experiments are more complex, that the sample is observed using different instruments, so they can approach more facilities with special instruments. So this way, we consider when registering and identifying what was done during a provenance, we identify a facility, and here is the question. In our opinion, ROR would be good, with of course with limitations, but honestly speaking, even in Czech Republic, facilities do not have ROR. ROR is used identifier for the institution which owns the facility. So it's not properly identifying the facility, even though I am mentioning it on this slide. And then for the specific instrument, we use a schema which is defined by PIDs, and I call PIDs A or PIDs B according to which instrument was used. So this is a standard approach in Czech bioimaging, but it applies more or less in the same way to material sciences infrastructures and facilities, where we have, as I said at the beginning, usually the facility has specific instruments, specific expertise, some specialized data processing. Even in case of high performance computing or some computational power, we still consider in our community approaching the facility in the administrative way, as I mentioned in my example, and then using an instrument which is the computational cluster, for example. So this way it is as of now done in Czech Republic. We do not have an instrument which will be presented, for example, by Rolf, where the situation with the facility and instrument, the relation is slightly different when it's synchrotron or similar facilities. But there is plan in Czech Republic for a big laser infrastructure, which will have one big instrument, but still we consider detectors which are associated with this one big instrument, similar to synchrotrons. We consider as instruments the detectors and not the laser, which is just providing the energy or some source of particles or kind of energy which is applied to the sample. So we will most probably use the similar model as here is seen with a more traditional way of facility, instrument facilities, that we are approaching a facility in this early kind of administrative way, and then we are working with an instrument which in that case will be a detector. So as I mentioned, this is more or less the situation in current situation in Czech, different Czech infrastructures where facilities are owning different instruments. I'm mentioning here few. The development will go probably in the same direction. And in Austria, actually, and in Poland, except of one case in Poland, the situation is very similar. I managed to talk to the head chairs of infrastructures, and they are more or less considering this as very similarly. So what in our community, so we are more using PIDs for specific instances of instruments, or in the future detectors which are associated with a large equipment. And then if we want to identify in a, for example, in a provenance, if we want to identify a facility, we need certain way of referring to the facility which we still think ROR may do the best job, or something similar, some identifier which is more similar to ROR than to PIDs in this case. So that's a presentation of one view. As Rolf mentioned, last time we had a different opinions, and this is one of the opinions expressed and now hopefully specified better what we mean by facility and by the instrument.
Okay, thank you. That was interesting. And as a next contribution ahead of the discussion would be from Matt Meyernick, who represents a project in the US on fair facilities and instrument.
Yes, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. So thank you, Rolf, for inviting me to be in this panel, and for everyone who's on the call today. So as Rolf said, I'm representing a project which is funded by the U.S. National Science Foundation. We started in late 2022 and are heading into the final year of our funded project. This is a research coordination network project. So this was specifically funded to do coordination across disciplines and organizations. And so that's what we've done. And I'm going to present some things that we've learned through this project related to instrument and facility identifiers, and some initial, very preliminary recommendations that we're hoping to work on in the next year. The core project personnel is myself and Greg Stossmeister, who's now retired, but at the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is a research center based in Boulder, Colorado. We also have University of Colorado Boulder, Florida State, and Stanford University as partners on this project. And as I said, we've been getting involvement from many other organizations as part of the network effort and the coordination focus of this project. So the focus is on trying to develop community and knowledge and guidelines and share information about persistent identifiers for instruments and facilities. We very much took ideas and built from the PIDs work that was done in the initial RDA working group. So we're not doing anything that would try to overlap or really change the metadata type of recommendations that group developed. We're very much building on that. We focused on compiling use cases for persistent identifiers for instruments and facilities. We've done several workshops, which I'll talk about, to get cross-cutting discussions on these topics. And then, as I said, we're getting towards some recommendations that we're wanting to work on this year. For us, we haven't tried to really define in a very strict way what facilities or instruments mean. We've certainly found that different groups have different understandings of those across the different disciplines and organizations. Just a couple of examples that I'll show here that motivated our project and that are involved in my organization. We've assigned DOIs to several, we call them facilities in our organization. Maybe they would be better called platforms or something like that. But that includes the airplane shown here on the right, which is a deployable facility or platform that has lots of different instruments that are just changed on and off for different experiments and flights. And then on the left is the integrated surface flux system, which is a carbon and other chemical flux measurement system that can be moved and deployed in various places. Again, which is configurable in certain ways. So those are the kinds of identifiers that we've assigned at my organization when we've started this effort really about 10 years ago, before we even had this funded project. Some of you may be familiar with research resource IDs, RRIDs. This is an identifier type that came out of the biomedical facility or biomedical community. And initially it was started for purposes like reagents, chemicals, lab materials, and things like that. Over the years, they expanded and, as shown on the right, have assigned identifiers to many what they call core facilities, which is a essentially refers to university campus-based facilities that people can use, such as microscopes, mass spectrometers, things of that nature that people can make use of on campuses. On the left here shows an example of our colleagues at Stanford who've even embedded these identifiers into the campus map to show where facilities are on the campus and to link to those information about those facilities. And likewise, the RRID system is used for instrumentation and has been assigned to many types of instruments. I'll come back in my recommendations to what we think these identifiers might be used and how they might be used differently, but I just wanted to note that there are already several types of identifiers being used for this purpose, that is instruments and facilities, including RORs as well. And that's part of the challenge right now is kind of consolidating information and guidelines across these different communities that use different identifier systems. So what we've done, just as just a capsule of that, we've done 2 major workshops in the fall of 23 and 24, bringing together over 30 stakeholders in each. We've had a small number of focus groups and presentations to many different communities about these topics. We've done some work writing of documentation and reports and one paper on key challenges and opportunities around PID assignment and adoption. And then we're developing our initial recommendations, as I mentioned before. If you are interested in more detail on our project website, the site has all of our products that are available so far. So this is a picture that we've developed to kind of try to get at the complexity of the PID system. And this is certainly not representing the full PID system. This is just a partial probably representation of what's going on in the PID system. But what I first want to convey is that what we've really experienced in our workshops is that for people who are new to this space or who've maybe heard of one of these, when they first start having these conversations, that this picture is incredibly confusing to people. And I think this is something that as a community of people who work on these things, we really need to reckon with the growth of and spread of use of PIDs. And on one hand, it's good. We're all interested in using these PIDs to do useful things, but the complexity of the ecosystem is really challenging and it's continuing to grow. And I think that's something that's going to be really difficult to deal with over the next 10 years. As you can see, there's overlaps in what these identifiers are used for. Many of them have no restrictions on what they can be used for. There's many different flavors of DOIs. They also have some overlapping uses. Different communities make use of these in different ways. So this is the current state, whether we like it or not. I think these discussions like we're having today can hopefully help us understand maybe how we can make these arrows a little bit more coherent, but this is what it is right now. So getting into some recommendations then in terms of how we understand this, and these are based on discussions we've had with the community and our own analysis. And again, these are very preliminary, not intended to be final, and this is for discussion, and we hope to get more community input on these. Some of these are quite simple, and some of them are a little more nuanced, perhaps. So in terms of the 2 basic IDs that we see used the most for facilities and instruments, DOIs and RRIDs, where would the optimal use be of these identifiers? Again, this is where we're at right now. DOIs seem to be better used for bespoke or unique instruments, so instruments that people are developing themselves or the kind of novel. And then there's for the RRIDs, there's very much a biomedical focus right now. I don't think they want to be exclusively biomedical, but that's really where their development has gone. And so it seems from our point of view, again, if you are not in the biomedical community, there's not much incentive to look at RRIDs right now. Again, people can certainly bring up counter arguments to that if they want. In terms of the RRIDs, beyond just biomedical applications, the way that they've developed their information system focuses on instrumentation at the model level. So it's sort of commodities that can be purchased from companies, but have many instances that might be fairly similar or identical across institutions. So this would be microscopes that could be purchased that have many different instances of those. They're not trying to track every instrument that exists in every location. They're really their identification system is focused on the model level. So if you're purchasing commodity instrumentation in a biomedical application field, again, this might be a good system for you. In terms of the RORs, I think we're somewhat agnostic on whether folks assign facilities RORs, but that gets into the next topic, which is around use cases. From our point of view, the ROR is not that useful when it comes to something like traceability. So if what you're wanting to get is tracking papers that have used a facility by people who are not affiliated with that facility, I don't think we've seen the ROR being a solution to that use case at this point. So that's where DOIs and potentially RIDs come into play if they're appropriate for you. But there are at least 4 use cases that have come up in our pretty strongly in our discussions. So traceability being you want to understand who's used your instrument. You want to look for papers. You want people to cite or acknowledge you and use that to trace products from a facility or an instrument. That's a use case. Reproducibility is a slightly different one, which is that you want to understand and essentially redo an instrument or redo a project by understanding the instruments, the facilities, the data, all that kind of stuff. That's a different use case than traceability. Provenance is more similar to reproducibility, but is subtly different, that you may not care about redoing something or reproducing, actually redoing a project, an experiment, but you want to understand how it happened, right? You want provenance information about where things came from, how they connect, how data sets connect instruments and that kind of thing. And then equity, which is a use case, which is more around discoverability of a facility or an instrument, making it known, sort of advertising. This was kind of the campus map example. So making something more visible, using identifiers to uniquely identify something so that people can understand that it exists, that they might use it themselves. And what we've kind of seen in terms of granularity of PID assignment is that the traceability and equity use cases, less granular PID assignment is more appropriate. So having a small number of identifiers that you then try to use consistently and have people cite consistently. Whereas if the reproducibility or the provenance use case is more important to you, a more granular level of PID assignment is probably a better approach or maybe more helpful. We have a couple of specific stakeholder recommendations. These should be pretty non-controversial. I would say publishers should add facility and instrument PIDs to author guidelines and align those with other guidance related to data and software. Funders ask funded facilities to assign and use PIDs. In the United States, this has not been the case. And we'll see where that goes in the near future. But also include guidance on instrument and facility PID assignment and data management planning documentation. So if there's data management plan requirements for research proposals, those should include some instructions on facility and PID assignment or citation. And then I think this is the last slide here on recommendations, facility and instrument providers. So providing clear citation or acknowledgement guidelines with PIDs when appropriate, if that's what you're trying to do with your PIDs. That seems like an obvious thing, but it's amazing how often people don't do this. And then include instrument and facility PIDs in metadata for resulting data sets. Again, that's sort of an obvious thing, but people often don't do that. On the data repository side, so this might be repositories that take data from facilities, but don't operate the facilities themselves or instruments. ask data depositors about the facilities and instruments in research, include those PIDs in metadata and documentation. And then for researchers themselves, document the usage of facilities and instruments via PIDs when possible. Again, these ones are fairly obvious, hopefully. So this is definitely my last slide. We do have another workshop planned for this fall in Boulder, Colorado. Let us know if you're interested. We have travel funding, the form on the bottom left. We'll take you to expression of interest form, and I'll get at that in the chat when I'm done here. I recognize that travel to the US may not be possible for many people or desired at this point. We potentially will have an online option for plenary discussions, probably not for breakout discussions that would be involved in the workshop. So if you're interested in that, you could email me directly or fill out this form and indicate that you're just interested in some kind of virtual thing if you're not able to travel to the US. So that's what we're doing this year, is working on these recommendations and using this workshop to hopefully finalize or really concretize those in a final form. So I'll stop there, Rolf.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And the final of the 3 prepared contributions is from myself. Oops. And I want to present the view in the photon and neutron community. So that community, what is operating large-scale facilities like synchrotron light sources, research reactors, spallation neutron sources, or free electron lasers. And what these facilities do, or what the instruments in these facilities do, is they use light, often X-ray, or neutrons as a probe to investigate some samples. And often these are user facilities, so you may submit a proposal for an experiment and apply for experiment time, and then you might be granted access to the facility and run your experiment. And in one interesting side remark is that this community is not about some particular scientific domain, but rather a class of experimental methods. And that means we have research from all the domains in our facilities. I would like to take my own facility, the Helmholtz-Zentrum Berlin für Material und Energie, HZB, as an example to explain a little bit the difference between the organization and the facility. So HZB operates the synchrotron light source BESI-2. It has about 60 experimental stations attached to 45 beamlines. And but not so some instruments are even installed by external partners. So we have one beamline from the Bundesanstalt für Materialprüfung, Forschung und Prüfung, BAM. And furthermore, so BESI-2 is not the, or was not the only facility run by HZB. We also operated a research reactor that was decommissioned in 2019. And HZB also plans for the successor of BESI-2, which will be BESI-3, to be in operation in the mid-2030s. And HZB provides that facility as a user facility for the scientific community. But also, of course, HZB is also a research organization and conducts its own research. So most of that research is using BESI-2, but some is not. So some research also in our house is not related to the facility at all. What I wanted to explain you with these statements is you should not confuse the facility with an organization that it operates. So BESI-2 and HZB are different things, and you cannot take the one for the other. That was is basically my message here. So for the semantic model, so we do have scientists that affiliate with organizations, or organizations employ scientists, and the organizations operate facilities, and those facilities have instruments as their components. And scientists might use facilities and instruments in those facilities in order to collect data. So that is the things to distinguish here. And interesting enough, it's very similar to what Marek explained here. So I don't think we were very, say, different in our, say, concepts. A few remark on, say, facilities versus organizations. So from our point of view, a research organization can be characterized with that it is a legal entity. It employs staff members, and scientists affiliate with organizations. Organizations may be member of other organizations, as HZB is member of the Helmholtz Association of German Research Centers. Organizations conduct research and they participate in research projects. But so none of these above statements makes any sense if you replace organization by facility. Because facilities are installations, it is hardware that are set up and operated by organizations. If you consider organizations versus instruments, so as I said, facilities are installations and devices used to collect data, and so are instruments. So this is not from the fundamental concept, it's not so different. Of course, facilities have instruments as components. So there is some kind of hierarchy between those. But also instruments have sensors and detectors as components. And some of these detectors, it is interesting that Marek explained the same example, kind of. So some of these detectors are instruments, or can be considered as instruments on their own. So we do have that hierarchy of an instrument being a component of an instrument also within the instrument realm itself. But that is not something that facilities distinguish with instruments. There is one distinction that I would admit, that so the instruments in a facility can often operate independently, and that means a facility can be used to run multiple experiments at the same time, and that you would most of the time not say state of an instrument. So that is clearly a distinction from them. And you also often say that facilities provide services, although I'm not so sure about that particular statement, because maybe it's rather the organization that operates the facility that provides that service. But okay, that can be discussed, of course. So the question is, could we use PID-inst for facilities? If we look at the PID-inst schema, then there's no single property that would not be applicable to a facility. So it just works. And in the other way around, if you think about what properties would you need to describe a facility that you would want to put in the PID record that would identify that facility, then I believe all of that would fit into the PID-inst schema. So in principle, PID-inst would be applicable to facilities. I don't see an issue there. The only reason why one might not want to PID-inst might be if we believe that we need to distinguish facilities from instruments in the in the level of the PID type to be used. And just as an other option that came into my mind that I wanted to name is, we could also use DataCite DOIs with resource type general service, which sounds a little bit odd at the first glance, but if you look into that definition of that resource type general, a service is an organized system of apparatus, appliance, stuff, etc. for supplying some function required by end users that almost fits for facilities. So that could also be an option from my point of view to be discussed with DataCite metadata experts, I would say. And that was already, say, my slides that I have. And now I'm pretty curious about the discussion that follows from these inputs. Larry, you raised your hand.
Thanks. So I really enjoyed your facilities versus locations or organizations slide. That was a nice bit of logic chopping. And I've only want to give a context here that there's a parallel effort from a completely different area going on in the DOI world, which is DOIs for venues. And by venue, they mean, and this is out of the entertainment world. As you may or may not know, DOIs are used for movies and TV shows. And the idea of a venue is like a concert stage. And they have their own, so in a way, it's like a facility, except it's where entertainment is performed. And they have constant names, but they move. They might be somewhere in the most extreme example, it would be on a ship that was moving around, and recordings can be made there and so on. And the further thing that might be of interest to this group is once you have a venue, you can then begin to think about identifiers for events at that venue. And that would also seem to fit with some scientific activities. So this problem is not unique with you guys. I think that the facility deserves its own kind of identifier, whatever that identifier is. And whether the PID schema is good enough for it, I don't know, because I don't know that well enough. But anyway, very interesting discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Larry. Marek.
Yes, thanks for patience of Matt, you, and now comment from Larry. Where I find a little bit issue is that when exactly in the slide where you were discussing facility and research organization, facility is not research organization. We can more consider it as a technology organization, and then we would go that would be probably, or technology infrastructure. In our region we call it more infrastructures than organizations when we speak about facilities. And there is definitely, at least in our use cases, there is definitely a service provided by facilities. So this is what I can definitely say, yes, there is service provided by facilities. For just to make an example, when you are measuring in preclinical or clinical measurement for using molecular imaging, the sample preparation be done by the facility. It is very rare that the researcher knows exactly how to prepare animal or human for the specific measurement. So this is a service which is provided by the facility. And the last thing I wanted to say, sorry. Yeah, you said that the user is using facility. So this is very specific context. Yes, I can agree with you, but not to create a data set. I would strongly argue that to create a data set, the user is using an instrument or a computational resource, but not the facility on its own. Yeah, you can, in other contexts, you can of course consider of user using facility, but not to create a data set, or I would even say not in whenever creating output in a digital form. Then more specific issue is used. And here I'm stopping.
Thank you. Françoise?
Yes, it's an outsider question. You know, when you say that PIDs schema is appropriate both for facilities and instrument, I think it's a very strong argument to keep it for both. But I also understand that there is no way in the schema to say that this entity is linked or belong to another entity. But it may be a way to get through the difficulty. I mean, to have a hierarchy which is included by information which is in PIDs one way or another. Sorry if it's completely out of scope, but from the outside, I like the fact that you can probably use the core PIDs for both, because it saves lots of effort.
Just allow me to add a comment to that. Yes, the PID schema allows for including the relations to other entities. So we adopted the related identifier from DataSite also for the PID schema. And we also explicitly for exactly this linking from instrument to sensors or detectors within the instrument, we explicitly included the has component and is component of a relation. So you can link an instrument with its component. So that is foreseen in the business scheme. Shoban.
Hi, folks. So I've got two things to really bring up and hope I can get some help with discussion around them. And the first Sandy's actually touched on is I think we need to be very careful with PIDs about what we actually want from it. Do we want a discipline-specific, more STEM-centered identifier, or do we want something more general working in the HAS space? I can say that we have facilities that are made entirely of people. So they're organizations, and the tools there, the instruments are the people there and their expertise. So it's not appropriate to use PIDs for them. I think they probably wouldn't like to be called an instrument. So that's something to make people aware of, that tendency for us to look at scientific disciplines as being the core use. They are in many cases, but do we want it to be extensible across other disciplines? I think we do. And the second thing is how we're using it in Australia. As an example, we're using PIDs. Their recommendations are for that to be used with a DOI for instruments, but we recommend RORs because they reflect the relationship to the organizational entity of that instrument. And the key use case for us is the CSIRO, so our Commonwealth Science Organisation, which is the overarching body, but it also has what we would call facilities nested within it. Not hierarchically sometimes. Sometimes it is hierarchically, but it's just a way of reflecting that relationship of where people are, where instruments are, and how they're being used. And that's all.
Yeah, thank you, Shoban. And allow me the remark that your example maybe hint to the problem that I mentioned in the beginning, that we have different concepts of the term facility, or that term is a little bit ambiguous in its usage, I believe. Baptiste.
Yes, thank you. I wanted so the talks were really interesting because I'm coming from the astronomy and mostly space physics community. So we are also modeling instruments and facilities in this domain, especially in space physics. I copied in the notes just two definitions that we have for observatory, which is the same thing as facility and instrument. And what has been shown by you, Rolf and Marek, I think fits, and also actually with, so this fits, I mean that the instrument are the thing that are the description, the object that is doing the measurement with measurement capabilities, parameters that you can describe that you are measuring. And the facility or the observatory is the platform on which you put those instruments, the location of that platform, or the light source. In astronomy, it would be the sky, the location where you look at. But I think that fits very well, at least for, I would say, physical, well, yeah, science studying physics, that I think we have a use case that fits very well. Then I think the small ontology that you've proposed, Rolf, would fit well to this kind of use case. And I agree with Marek that probably the use would be rather to instrument rather than facility, but yeah, that can be discussed. But this organization with ROR's facility in the middle, which is the platform, as I think it was Matt saying that, and instruments that are doing the actual detection, I think is something that fits well what we do. I agree with Siobhan that probably in social sciences, in anthropology, yeah, the instrument is the people. So I don't know how to fit this in, indeed.
Yeah. Okay, Matt.
Yeah, thanks. These are all really interesting comments, and I was going to follow up on a couple things. In our report from our first workshop, we included some definitions, very high level, of a couple of these topics. There's actually some nice vocabularies that provide definitions of instruments. So I think that one's pretty straightforward. For facilities, we had a lot of discussion of what is a facility, what is the difference between a facility and an instrument and a platform. NASA, for example, had some NASA folks at our first workshop, and they use the term platform, referring to satellites that contain multiple instruments, I think like Baptista just described. And what we noted for key characteristics of facilities is that they have people, as Siobhan mentioned, and the location may be important, kind of related to what Larry said earlier on. The other thing I guess I wanted to mention, and maybe this is a question back to you, Siobhan, about your use of RORs for facilities, is that the use case seems to be a very important thing to start with in terms of a lot of these questions. You know, what are you trying to do? What do you what's your goal of using PIDs, and how are you using them? You know, where are you putting them? Where do you want them to show up, and that kind of thing. So maybe Siobhan, back to you on a question for the RORs that you're using for facilities. I guess the short question is, what are you doing with them? You know, where do you want them to show up? Kind of how are you using them?
So another good example is National Cooperative Research Infrastructure, the NCRES funding that comes from the I think Education Department, that funds I think 36 facilities or projects across Australia. They're all housed, bar about 2, within other organisations. So the imaging facilities, for example, the Australian National Imaging Facilities, are spread across multiple universities. So we have RORs for some of them as part of our national PID strategy that we're involved in. Happy to talk about it ad nauseum. We are looking at the best option of standardising how we describe where data is coming from and who it's done by and where it was made. So it's not appropriate to say the University of Queensland produced this data on this instrument when it's actually funded by the NCRES funding, which is federal. So we want, the use case there is how can we find out where federal money is going? How's it being used? How can we find out where good return on investment is happening? So are we getting good data sets out of that investment? And who are the people that are running those instruments? Does that help, Matt?
It does. And so I guess the follow-on question would be, how do you hope RORs are used to facilitate those connections? And what I'm
Sure.
thinking about here is our use case when we started, our effort was citation. So, if you want something to be cited, let's use a DOI. Or our logic was not much more complicated than that. And so my question then back is about RORs is, do RORs fit into the workflow of citation or acknowledgement in the same way that a DOI does, or how are you hoping that will work?
Before that, so they have reporting requirements each year. So we want to automate that reporting from the NCREST facilities through the instruments. So ROR will be how they report where it was done. I'm thinking about that idea of location that you mentioned more and more now. So where it was done.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I mean, in a sense, you bring in yet another aspect, which would be the aspect of projects and funding, which has its own identifiers yet again.
I know, isn't it terrible? It's so complicated. To just talk a little bit more through that, I was part of the development team for RAID, and I wrote the ISO standard for it. So I'm very much in favour of project IDs, and we're part of that's one of the, we're calling them priority PIDs as part of our national PID strategy as well. Because once you start having a few identifiers, you need to start having more identifiers, but then where do you stop? So we've kind of ratcheted it down to a list, much like what Matt's done. So what are people actually using? What's going to be best for linking up? How can we make things more usable?
Okay, thank you. Are there any more, say, discussion points, comments, questions? Otherwise, I mean, I would have another question for Shoban. In your concept of facilities, as you named it, are facilities operable organizations? And what distinguishes then the facility from the organization that operates it?
Yeah, so we've been discussing how we do this. One of the things was, does it have an Australian business ID? In which case it becomes a separate organisation. Should we use that? We've decided to leave it really broad right now because of that issue with being cross-disciplinary. So we can't say to be a facility, you need to be attached to a larger organisation, you know, physically with people or financially, because sometimes it's the other way around. It becomes the larger organisation and other smaller ones are attached to it. So we're really developing our definitions around this still, Rolf, I must say. At the moment, it is, does it exist and does it get used? Would you like one?
Otherwise, I'm maybe also add a comment. So the main reason why I say reject is a little bit too strong, but I have concerns of using RORs for facilities is taking the example of HZB as I presented it. We are very keen to educate our staff members whenever they make a publication to say indicate properly their affiliation with the HZB ROR. And we would spoil that effort if we would introduce yet another ROR for the same organization, and that would create a huge confusion. And as I said, BESI 2 is not to be confused with HZB. It is different things. So we cannot use the same identifier for both.
Yeah.
But we don't want another ROR for HZB.
Yeah, there's also this in-between space where, because we're looking at capturing return on investment metrics, these kind of things as well, we want to capture the activity that's coming out of the facility. And that's not always stuff that gets cited. So sometimes it's to be able to say this amount of allocations of beam time, that kind of thing. Is that is that appropriate to use a raw there? I would think so, because it's just a way for us of standardizing what organizations did you interact with to make this data. But for publications, yeah, that's a different thing as well. And we really don't want to be coming across with this confusing message of memorize 14 RORs. It can't be that way. It needs to be automated in some way, at least at the workflow end of things. Yeah, I'm not sure of a solution.
Baptiste, you're unmuted. Do you want to jump in? No, okay. Marek.
I would like to use the recommendation of Matt, who said that, and I fully agree that it's about the use case. So why don't we go back and speak about use cases, and then find out what fits the use cases for facilities or the instruments, where I was a little bit surprised when he was presenting RRID as a identifier for instruments, but then I fully agree that if it's some small model which is everywhere and it's not important too much detail, technical detail for it, RRID may be very useful identifier for this kind of instruments. So why don't we go back to use cases and try to really point, we need this and we need that. And then at some point it will probably, we will get to the point that we will know what we want in more generic terms.
Just respond to that. I think that's where we've gotten most traction. I think there's so many of these discussions that are, you get down in details or you circle back around, and I think that's where we found the most benefit, is circling back to the use case. And I think another point here could be about somebody in the chat, and I'm sorry who I don't remember who it was, trying to find it here, made a comment. Emmanuel, facilities are obviously something in between instruments, people, and organizations, depending on the setting. We have PIDs for all these concepts. Wouldn't it be better to modify fields within these PID types to be able to identify facilities within them? So that prompts in my mind a question of, does it really matter, or should it matter which PID type you use, assuming you can get metadata for that entity using the PID, hopefully in a consistent way, and or functionally there's no difference in choosing one. So I don't know if there's functionally a difference. If you were to choose a DOI or a ROR for a facility, however you define it, maybe it's worth also thinking about what would be different in terms of what you get from that, and then connect that, as Marek said, to the use case. So it sounds like there's a couple of comments here.
Yeah, thank you, Marek.
So if I can jump on this idea, which is okay if I'm using a fully automated system, the engines are not going to ask me about the too large variety, but as a person who is training people in fair data, and this would be seriously confusing. So I don't know how to deal with this issue for the training.
Baptiste?
Yes, about this idea that, yeah, we could use different PIDs, type of PIDs, like DOIs, RORs, or depending on the use case, or even ORCID if it's people. I think that, well, if you think of it as a knowledge graph, we are trying to build a knowledge graph, that's perfectly fine. Then the question is, if you want to operate that knowledge graph and do things, then if you use different PIDs, you have different metadata attached, and then you have an interoperability issue. So yeah, that's just my comment. It's this is what we have to think of.
Yeah, and as a comment from myself, Todd, I agree that it might not matter too much which PID type we use. So that might even be not so important. What is important, I believe, is that it is always well understood what exactly is that particular PID pointing to, so that these PIDs are then used in the proper way, and that needs to be understandable. Others say comments, remarks.
Just follow up on that point again, Rolf. One thing we've started in our project but haven't gotten very far on is trying to document the differences and similarities between these different systems. And so some of the things we already talked about would be part of that. You know, what metadata do they provide? As Baptista just mentioned, some of them have costs, some of them don't. The resolution of them is quite different. So RRIDs is definitely an outlier in terms of how resolution works. And you know, other things around persistence or editability, you know, those kinds of things. So that might be a useful effort here, is to try to identify how are these things different. So if one was to choose one, what's the functional differences that you, what are the capabilities that you have available to you depending on what you choose? But what we've seen in our project, it seems to be, because of all of the confusion that we're talking about right now, what tends to happen is that people choose the ones that they see other people similar to them choosing. So it's much more of a social dynamic of, you know, if I'm in the biomedical community and I see everyone using RRIDs, why would I choose something else? You know, I would choose RRIDs. In our context, we were using DOIs, and every organization we were talking to was using DOIs for data sets and software. And so we were thinking about, well, why not just use DOIs? Because that fits in with what we're doing and what other organizations similar to us are doing. And similarly, probably with the RORs. So I don't think that's necessarily a good, I mean, it's not maybe not the ideal reason why people are choosing things, but I think that's why people are choosing what they're choosing at this point, is largely social reasons plus a little bit of functionality.
Yep. Siobhan?
Yeah, I'm going to back that one up, Matt. I think it's really important to look at what disciplines and what community are using, and actually to let them lead the way. Kind of going back to the idea of looking at use cases again. Sometimes it's really tempting to say, use this thing, but when you find that it just doesn't work for some communities. And the best practices that we put out about 2 years ago, and they're probably a little bit out of date now. So we put out best practices around instrument identifiers for Australasia. We said really clearly in it, these are recommendations, but if your discipline does it differently, do it the way your discipline does it, because that's how researchers have worked for, you know, millennia. We can't change that. We shouldn't change that, but we should be guided by best practices around things like, you know, how do these PIDs join to other PIDs? That's really good guidance we can give. I don't think we need to be dogmatic about any of this, though.
Yeah, thank you. Allow me one comment on RIDs for instruments, even if it's not exactly the scope of that session here. In the discussion in the PIDs group, we were more or less agreed that RIDs would be appropriate for the type of the instrument, whereas PIDs is for the individual instrument instances. And as Matt pointed out, if you don't care about the individual instance, if you just say, I use that particular, say, brand of a microscope, then you don't need an individual PID for that instance, and then you might go for an RID. Siobhan.
Oh, that's an accident. Sorry.
Otherwise, I mean, I guess there is not one size fits all, in particular for facilities. I guess when I don't know whether we say set up a follow-up activity on that, but if we were to formulate a recommendation, then I would tend to say, make up your mind first what you mean by facility, and depending on what you say end up describing there, then you might end up using different PID systems. Are there more comments, discussion points? Yeah, sure one.
Something that I think might be very useful is for contact to be made with the folks at RAW to update their information that they have online about possible uses for RORs. We had a little chat about it in the chat that it's a bit out of date. And I think getting some clarity from them would probably help some people making those decisions.
Okay, honestly, I'm not very good at following the chat and moderating the session at the same time. So hope you can copy the most relevant notes of that into the collaborative notes. And as you remind me of that, I will post the link once again. Okay. More comments.
So don't we
just
want
about,
that?
sorry.
Go ahead.
No, that was just for Rolf. At the end, well, I don't know who's going to receive the breakout chat, but yeah, someone should receive it. I don't know if Rolf, you will receive it. It's not so easy to copy. Yeah, you can copy. We could copy before the end.
Yeah, I guess we need to copy it that manually. I'm not sure whether there is any systematic on who is going to receive it. So if we don't save it before the session ends, then I'm afraid it's lost.
Don't we want to take on what Matt and their project is already doing, but to take it there and the use cases and maybe to elaborate in a more global, from a more global perspective on this, and provide feedback somehow to cross-communicate their outputs in RDA work group, and because that may be useful.
Yeah, that obviously we would enjoy that. I think some of you, Rolf, maybe others, are on our mailing list. When we have products, we email those out. So, you know, if those could go out on PID lists, that would be great. What we're, as I said, trying to do is to get some guidance that we can send out that others can take and adapt. So I think we're very much seeing our work as feeding into these activities that are happening global. I don't think we want to have any claim on having the definitive advice on all of this, but we're getting a lot of input from various communities, and so we're happy to feed that into activities happening in the RDA and elsewhere.
Okay. I guess we are not controversial enough to. Okay, Lindsay.
Yeah, so I had a quick question. Is there a choose your own adventure menu put together by everyone? So sort of it's like a user profile selection. So, you know, if you wanted to really profile metrics, or you wanted to really provide credit, or you're really just after the instrument object itself, and it's less controversial there, is there something that does exist that you can go and make those decisions from the documents that exist? where it kind of profiles these different use cases and kind of having that as a guidance doc, like a singular doc.
I had a little bit problem with your audio, but you were requesting for documentation and guidance documents. Is that correct?
Yeah, just like a place you can go that would be almost like a selection menu. Like, oh, this is my use case. I could use this in this way, or this is my use case. And then there's not confusion about false adoption, like kind of had Matt touched on, where I'm just using it because I think I'm supposed to be using it, kind of a thing.
I'll respond quickly. So I just put in the chat a tool that came out of the Dutch Digital Heritage Network. This is something that I was pointed to, so I don't have any connection to it, but I think this is the closest thing to what you described. I can't vouch for everything in there, but that might be something to take a look at. I don't know that it has every PID we've discussed in there, for example, but it's generic, but it does have some questions about what type of resource do you have and things like that. So I think that's the closest thing that I've seen to something like you were describing. But it might be worth revisiting this idea because I think this was a few years old at this point.
What?
Yes, I was going to suggest something very similar, starting from your comment that community practices and cultures are very different in the domain, and having a set of examples, telling people you have to think about what you want to do and why, and then showing examples which can help people to think for themselves. I think from what I hear, I have the impression it would be useful. Except if it's done elsewhere, but I am not sure.
Come on.
I can point you to some of the work that's been done by More Brains Consulting. So they've consulted with a few countries now on national PIDs strategies. And they've got some really good documentation around which PID to use for what and kind of international recommendations. They're a little bit more general, but they're quite a good place to start from, I found. I popped them some into the chat there. But for more kind of national scale stuff, I think Ireland, Australia, the UK have all had reports written by them, and you can access those reports.
Otherwise, there's also pitforum.org. I don't know whether I didn't follow it recently, but oh shit.
Yeah, but that's not very active in the direction of instruments and facilities, because they simply consider that this is done by RDA, by actually our working group. So.
Okay. So, any more comments, suggestions, questions? I mean, if that is not the case, I don't know whether we came to a conclusion early.
I think certainly if we have some kind of agreement that we should be looking at use cases and discussing those more, that's a great place to start and move on from.
I mean, okay, that is hinting at another, say, people taking that up and following on that. Obviously, that, say, raises the question on who these people are going to be. But Emmanuel.
No, I think that's a very good suggestion to collect, let's say, a couple of examples as how facilities were registered or wherever. So we have some practical examples beyond the ones that you presented, of course, how they are used, and how they differ from other concepts, like, for example, sometimes projects, or which we did not cover here, I think, and what exactly people consider as facilities. I mean, let's take it that way, because in the end, we're having a semantic discussion here on what a facility is, while in reality we are looking for arguments to describe what we're trying to register. So I think that's why we're considering different PID systems, because we come with different metadata, and we just assume we are using the one that matches the best. So I think examples would help there, because personally I wasn't aware of facilities that are made up of people. That's an interesting concept. So I think that these examples would help all of us to move forward with that and better describe what we have. I mean, the other thing that always comes to my mind is that facilities are, in the university context, often are entities that have an account, a bank account, or an account number, as you said, that receive funding. So if you don't have an account number at the university, you're not existing. So technically, that would be another way to describe facilities. But examples would, as I said, would help very much.
Yeah, okay. Again, that sounds like a call for volunteers in compiling that information. I mean, I'm afraid I just submitted a statement of a work for yet a completely different working group. So I'm a little bit reluctant to take that action on me.
Yeah, I'm happy to volunteer to help with that.
I mean,
yeah, me too. I mean, that's. I mean, in the end, it's a list for the moment that we should submit with this report for this meeting, I guess, so we can not just put it at the end, the collaborative notes, to see what kind of facilities could we envision, or do we envision, or do we see?
I mean, of course, we could take it in the auspices of the PIDs working group in maintenance mode. But again, it requires somebody to do that, and that somebody will not be me. So I'm happy to take that on the agenda of one of the next monthly meetings to discuss follow-up activities. But again, it needs people to do it. Andrea.
Hi. I am a software engineer, and I'm quite interested about this idea because it's coming from the software is one of the first things that you learn when you are studying, because it is using the database, is using an object. I put one message in the chat that says, first of all, we needed to understand what we wanted to identify, because I'm speaking, for example, schema.org, and we have a thing, and then we have one identifier, and I'm just working with the W3C on this one, and I raise a couple of questions. For example, do we need a subtype for DOI? And it's this is last week, so it's very fresh. And it says, no, we already have the subtype. And it says, well, there is a mistake done, because we can have more than one identifier for the same entity. And so schema.org, as from my perspective, has already a design fault, because we have only one identifier. But for example, an organization can be identified in a different way. You have different, for example, from the VAT number, if I'm in UK, or it could be another ID. So there is a facility. Previously, Emmanuel says, well, if you have an account number, so you are an entity inside university, so you could be identify from my perspective, is everything could be identified. Everything could be a tag, or could be an ID, or a UUID v4, or whatever the number is. So in terms of software, and then, for example, I'm working on GMP Online, so the fact that we needed to exchange information for data management plan, we have a lot of requests to integrate with one identifier and another identifier. To be honest, it's a bit of jungle at the moment because there are so many identifiers, even for the same entity. But for example, I can identify a document with a DOI or a ARK, but it's the same document. In these terms, what I'm thinking is, do we want to exchange identifier and metadata? There was a slide that I saw before that was all this information coming to. That should be something that is outside, go beyond the DOI or ARK and whatsoever, that says, okay, we want to identify this one that will be unique and no other standard will be attached, or this number cannot be attached to a different standard. I'm not sure if I'm explaining. So a single identifier that can put all together different identifier. I'm taking this example again for the organization. It could be ROR, but is the VAT number for that organization inside that context is still a valid identifier, for example. So it's very much more broad in terms of software engineering. It's not just in a context inside of research, but also how we implement this later on.
Yeah, thank you. Any more comments?
So what would you suggest? I mean, you said there, so I didn't get it. So you said there is a meeting like next month of this group. So maybe we should, whoever is interested should show up there, and then we'll make a plan there.
I mean, this meeting here is a joint session of the Working with PIDs into its interest group and the Persistent Identification of Instrument Working Group. Unfortunately, none of the chairs of the Working with PIDs into its interest group could make it to the session, so the chairs from that group are not present. But of course, the Persistent Identification of Instrument Working Group could take the subject on the next monthly meeting. So we still meet monthly, and we could say discuss say follow-up activities on the subject.
Can you send the announcement of the working group to the people attending the session with the list of emails that are in the notes?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So that if people are not yet in the working group, they can join.
Yeah, and for your information, so the next monthly meeting would be May 7. And it would be in the morning. That means this is an Australia-friendly time, looking into the direction of Schoban.
That sounds great. It's currently 1:30 in the morning.
Yeah, and of course I can send a particular invite to all those who subscribe to the collaborative notes with their email address.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, well, it depends on somebody has to take up that, say, task and say, lead to some activity. I have one question. Is anybody able to save the chat? I seem to have...
It is done. It is done. I copied everything.
Okay, thank you. I had, say, issues on trying to do that. Okay. I mean, of course, you can exactly as just posted in the chat, you can just join the PIDs working group. And if you do that, then you can also see the posts of the invitation to the meeting. Then you don't need to wait for that mail from me to be sent. But I will take that as an action on me to send the reminder anyway. Otherwise, we are like 3 minutes to the end of the session, of the formal end. And I have the impression that, yeah, that there's no more comments to that. So I guess we are not forced to spend 3 minutes here. If not, anybody say raises their voice and has anything else important to say. So Baptiste, you copied the chat in the collaborative notes, or?
Yes, yes, and I have the last version now, so I just copy it. It's only thank yous that are added, so I will not copy everything. But yeah, I will put everything there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank, first of all, the speakers of the contributions, so Marek and Matt. And I would like to thank all of you. It was really a pleasure to say moderate that session. It was a very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Rolf.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, Rob.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.